Started. Again, welcome everyone to the Landscape Fuel Treatment Effectiveness webinar. My name is Corey Davis, and I am the Science Communication Specialist for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. And I just wanted to run through a few logistics here before we get started. Please let us know in the chat window if you're having any audio problems, but you should be able to use either your computer audio or call in. All attendees are muted. The recording for this webinar will be posted to the Northern Rockies YouTube channel, and the link is there, pretty easy to find in YouTube. Please put any questions that you have for our speakers in the Q&A window. So we're going to save the chat window for more discussion and responses, but if you have specific questions, please use the Q&A method for that. Hopefully you'll see that in your menu with the Q&A box. Closed captions are available. You just need to hit the live transcript button to see those. We are also offering continuing education credits through the Society of American Foresters, and you'll need to submit a claim for that. We'll put in the list of attendees. Also, at the very end, a survey will pop up when you leave. It's a very short survey, but it really helps our program. So if you could fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. So the way this is going to work today, our presenters will give a brief review of their work, and then we'll move into a facilitated discussion. We're going to hold questions for the speakers until they've all talked about their work. So you can still put the questions in the Q&A, but we're going to circle back and answer them after everybody's done. There we go. I just want to say a few words about the Fire Science Exchange Network. This is a network through the Joint Fire Science Program, and there are fire science exchanges across the country. Many of them came together to partner on this webinar today. They're listed at the bottom there, but if you live in any part of the country and you're interested in finding out easy way to access fire science, please visit our websites. We host a lot of webinars like this, workshops, field trips. We also have a lot of products like science reviews and research briefs. Also, large database that you can search for fire science on specific topics or authors. So please check out our websites for the latest fire science. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Terry Jane, who's going to get the ball rolling here and kind of give an overview of this work that's been completed by her and the team she's been working with.
Good morning, everyone. I'll just share my screen so you guys can see. Okay, well, I am so glad that everybody has set aside time to kind of listen to this webinar. And I feel really privileged that even though I am now retired, I can actually step back into the real world and actually do this again for at least a little while. So today we're going to really kind of basically tell you what we know about landscape fuel treatment effectiveness within the context of the literature, the science, those kind of things. Basically, I'm Terry Jane. I was the lead investigator on this project, and I was contacted by Joint Fire Sciences Program to put a national team together to really understand and put a synthesis together about what we know about landscape fuel treatment. Now, these are not just within the treatment boundaries, but outside the treatment boundaries. How are the treatments affecting how a fire would burn across a landscape? This goes. There you go. So as team lead, I asked people from across the country to see if they wanted to invest in spending time to do this synthesis. And our first set of meetings was really kind of trying to figure out what we needed to do. But as a result of that, we basically broke the team into sub-teams. And each sub-team kind of attacked a certain particular piece of the synthesis. We soon recalled that a lot of the synthesis, some of them were simulations, some of them were actual studies, others were case studies, and mixing and matching them would just not work. And so that's why we broke into sub-teams and then took each section. And so today, Sharon Hood, Sean McKinney, Jeff Ott, and Alexandra Urso will be the presenters because they were the leads of each of these sub-teams. So the first thing we did was search the literature, and with the help of the National Forest Service Library, we identified over 2,000 publications. But we wanted to focus on a landscape perspective. And although many papers say landscape in the title, they don't often define a landscape or even use a landscape when they're actually talking about the results. As a function of that, we dropped all the way down to about 179 total papers that looked at landscape field treatment effectiveness. And we broke them up into basically three kinds of classes. The empirical studies, which were like testing hypothesis, where they had actual treatments on the ground followed by a fire. Case studies, these are by manager input. They were actually documented manager stories about particular fires hitting a particular set of treatments. And then we had an abundance of papers concerning model simulation. That's basically where most of the literature's at. And then Sharon Hood and Morgan Varner and myself kind of took a bigger picture and said, how can we look at expanding landscape field treatment monitoring more at the landscape than rather at the site? And so today we're going to actually give you a summary of each of these four elements. And we're going to start with Sharon, followed by the empirical studies, simulations, and then we'll finish with the case study. So basically, out of the synthesis, we came up with primarily 5 stories. And each of these are published. They're out of Fire Ecology. I believe we have the links in the announcement. And then we also have a Science You Can Use bulletin. It's issue 59. If you just kind of want to quickly browse of what are the main outcomes of that. And then uniquely, the Joint Fire Sciences Program actually had a special request for proposals that address some of the key research gaps that we identified. So with that, Sharon is unable to be here right now. She'll be here for the question and answer period, but I'm going to be giving her presentation. And it's really talking about how do we quantify wildfire hazard and field treatment effectiveness from the stands all the way to the landscape. So I think it's important to kind of bring up a point about field treatment. Oftentimes we think about fuel as the only thing that we can actually manipulate physically. But when you're talking about landscapes, we need to also think about the topography and weather within the fire behavior triangle. Yes, we can't change the topography, but how we place our field treatments across topography may make a huge difference as to how it's going to perform in a wildfire. And secondly, we need to really think about what kind of conditions our field treatments are going to be tested. Are they going to be kind of on typical fire weather, which is very manageable, where we can actually do active, effective fire suppression? Or are we going to be testing those field treatments across a landscape when we have a fire that we can't put out under extreme conditions? So when we think about landscapes, we really have to think about the full fire triangle, fire behavior triangle. And then we also had to think about forest field treatment principles. And often we think about the dry forest, the Agee and Skinner type of principles that they identified, which is really reducing surface fields, increasing the distance of the ground to the tree crowns, which we often refer to ladder fields, increase spacing between crowns, and then retain large trees of fire-resistant species. But oftentimes the field treatment, when you're entering into other forests or range ecosystems, other things have to come into play. Fuel moisture dynamics, the topography, species composition and structure, the growth and development for treatment longevity, and you need to think about other disturbances like bugs and disease and cruds, other things that might play into what's happening across that landscape. And so in short, we need to think more of a landscape mosaic. And the patch size and the distribution of that composition and structure is going to vary depending on the particular forest or range ecosystem, or even grassland ecosystems, depending on what the fire regime was, or how we're going to be manipulating that forest into the future or particular ecosystem. So we need to think much broader than the site. We have to really think about the landscape and how each individual stand or site fits in within that larger space. A lot of times we think of isolating fuel treatments as the standalone treatment, and we don't consider other treatments across the landscape. And silviculture really is a combination of vegetation manipulation within the context of the landscape and the management objectives. So not only do we have to think about that, but we also have to think about the fuel strata focus. One of the things that we found in our literature is we refer to prescribed fire and mechanical treatments, but we really never mention what is the fuel strata focus. Is it dealing with surface fields? Is it trying to remove the ladder fields? Are we shifting composition from fire, from trees that might die quickly from fire, or from more fire resistant species? How are these all fitting together? And sometimes one of the challenges we had in our synthesis, do we just focus on studies that focused on fuel treatments alone, or do we focus on studies that included restoration treatments? Often we had to just drop to fuel treatments alone because that was the clearest way we could really identify what were the fuel strata that were manipulated. So we need to really think about the landscape, not only for fuel, but across the whole landscape as far as other objectives and what is the fuel strata that's actually being treated or removed. So currently, the way we monitor our fires is basically acres of fire or activity type, area in high or very high wildfire hazard potential, the number of fires, and the acres burned. But in reality, that doesn't tell us anything about how that landscape burned. What was the result of a fire after? What was the result of that landscape mosaic after a wildfire? So we have challenges in fuel management programs. Where do we go? How much do we treat? All of these different questions. And how often do we treat? What's the longevity or effectiveness of a fuel treatment? We really don't know how to monitor for that. And we don't know how to learn from what we've done in the past to the future and how we can manipulate and adapt our treatments as we move forward. So the big question is how do we couch individual fires into the big picture, into that larger landscape? And how do we quantify effectiveness of treatments at the landscape level? Because we tend to focus on either the treatment or the landscape, but not really integrating them both. So one of the big things about this particular paper is, can we shift from thinking and reporting acres burned to how did the fires burn? In other words, right now we do year-to-year date statistics, number of fires and acres burned. That's how we report it. But we really need to report it in such a way that we're actually focusing on the landscape, understanding how the stands or sites fit into that, and really characterize what's happening to that landscape. So Sharon and Morgan and I both came up with an alternative. And the idea is to push our monitoring focus to the landscape level. So we recognize that there's site and stand attributes that we'll always quantify, but we also need to think about landscape attributes. So we came up with phase one, which is evaluating hazards. And this would be prior to a fire, or maybe it's right now, current condition as in Forest Service, you go down NEPA, you're really doing a hazard evaluation. And you look at the surface field loads, the canopy base height, you do all that at the stance, but you also have to look at the landscape attributes. What is the fire return interval? What's the mosaic of the different conditions that might be out there? What is the treatment extent? What is the percent of area treated? What might, through modeling, potential flame lengths, how would a fire behave as it went across that landscape? These are some things that you need to think about as you move to that landscape level. And we have many, I guess, tools to help deal with that. Phase two is evaluating treatment effectiveness. In this situation, we switch the attributes we're looking at, and we think of fire severity, fire size, strategic point protection ability, all these different things that might be important to how we can understand how that landscape and suppression tactics interacted with each other. Then we have things like fire suppression under the social fire suppression opportunities or suppression costs. Did we lose structures? And that would be something that we would focus across that entire landscape that we'd be studying. So we thought of phase 1 and a phase 2 situation. So here's an example of, say, phase 1. In this situation, we have a current value, which is the gray blocks with black dots in it, and those are individual sites or stands. And you can imagine this being maybe a shared stewardship priority landscape. So you have multiple ownerships thrown in there, and you'll notice that there's not just an average for one value. You have a median, which is the black line across the block, and then you have variation that might be going across that landscape. So the gray is what it is, and the green bars, or the second bar, is what your target is. And yes, some areas may be dense. You're not going to create this homogeneous, equally spaced trees in some places. And that's okay. That's something that we have to accept because we can't treat every acre. But you might be able to prepare your treatments and a design to actually move towards that green square. Then in 2045, 20 years later, you can turn around and go through it again and say, whoa, we've really increased the ladder fields because we opened up the stands too much and we got tons of regeneration. So now we have to revisit that and reset our target. And that incorporates some learning on stand development and growth. It gives you that feeling of how often we need to time it, those kind of things. So this kind of landscape monitoring, looking at the variation, accepting some of that variation becomes really important. And it forces us to look at a landscape view, but yet understand how the different elements in that landscape actually contribute to the variation across that landscape. And then we have a wildfire. So then after the wildfire, we go and look at how did that landscape perform? Once again, the gray bars. What was the area burned? What were the characteristics of the fire severity? What was the characteristic patch size? Are we happy with that? Was it, often I tell people after a fire, would you be content with what is left or the conditions that were created? Maybe not. Then we set up a new scope. Okay, here's our new target for severity. And how do we adjust our landscape treatment or how we apply the treatments across that landscape to aim more towards that green target? From a social value, we have different measurements that we can use. And we can identify, well, we really missed our particular spot. We produced too much smoke. We had problems with evacuation. What do we need to do to kind of improve upon that? And so from that perspective, we're learning as we get every treatment. As we move through time, we start to learn what is it how that particular landscape behaves. So it's actually an iterative kind of approach. You have a hazard, phase 1, and you maybe have a treatment focus. We're going to focus on ladder fields in this particular part of the landscape around development, those kind of things. And then in 20 years, you come back and you say, well, it really changed. We need to adjust and adapt it. Or maybe after the third monitoring, we need to start doing some maintenance treatments. We need to think about how we're going to maintain some of this stuff and where our focus will be in that landscape. And then we have a disturbance, wildfire and or disease or any type of thing. Then we can go and say, well, how did that fire give us some benefits according to that landscape? And then we continue on through this. But what's cool about this approach is we're focusing on the landscape, tearing down to the stand, and also doing it in an iterative way so that we can actually start learning about how our treatment and how our current condition is interacting with those disturbances. And with climate change and drought, we need to really be aware about how the landscape is moving, because everything that we are going to be facing is going to be a landscape type of disturbance. It's going to be drought, it's going to be disease, it's going to be wildfire. Everything is going to be performing at the landscape. And we really need to start monitoring at that landscape level. And so that's really where we push the idea about landscape treatment effectiveness particularly when we found that we had very, very little of that kind of monitoring. So the conclusion is fuel treatment effectiveness framework allows ways to quantify current fuel hazards and fuel treatments, not only at the landscape level, but also over time. And so the next speaker I'm going to introduce is Sean McKinney.
Thanks, Terry. Well, we focused on the subset of studies that were empirically based. And before we address this basic question of whether or not there's evidence for landscape level fuel treatment effectiveness, we need to ask ourselves, well, what would that evidence look like?
Hey, Sean,
Yes.
we can't see your screen.
No, I'm sorry. Which screen are you seeing?
We're not, it doesn't look like you're sharing right now.
Okay.
So maybe if on your end it says you're sharing,
It says I'm sharing entire screen.
okay, hit stop share.
Choose what to share entire screen. Now?
There we go.
Okay.
Yep, there
Thanks.
we go. Thanks.
Okay. Still good? Okay.
Yep.
So we want to distinguish between site level effects and landscape level effects. We know from abundant literature that there's a lot of evidence for fuel treatments mitigating wildfire effects within the boundaries of treated areas. And that's what we refer to as site level effects. So comparing within treatment to out of treatment locations. But clearly it's not possible, nor is it desirable to treat all locations across the broad spatial areas. And that kind of leads to this general problem of how do we implement treatments to affect wildfire behavior at broad spatial extents, often referred to as a landscape. So from simulation studies that we'll hear about here shortly, we see that results suggest that specific treatment types, their spatial arrangement, relative density can alter wildfire behavior outside of that treatment footprint. And that's what we call landscape level effects. So if we think about this in designing an empirical study, how we would go about this, we can think about this landscape level effect as a hypothesis. And that would posit that fuel treatments can affect wildfire behavior outside of their footprints. To test this hypothesis, a study must quantify a link between conditions within fuel treatments and some metric of fire behavior outside of the footprint. In scenario A at the top, well, in both A and B, the border represents a wildfire. So obviously it's a hypothetical situation. The lighter line is the wildfire boundary and the darker circles are treatment locations. In A, the lighter lines represent contours of influence where the effect of the treatment permeates into untreated areas and decays with distance from treatment boundary. The asymmetric contour lines reflect the notion of fire behavior outside of the treatment boundaries will also be influenced by spatial heterogeneity in biological and physiographic characteristics. The white areas represent untreated areas that are unaffected by conditions within the treatments. So scenario A can be interpreted as a prediction of the landscape level effect hypothesis, that if it's true, then a spatial relationship exists between within treatment and outside of treatment conditions during a wildfire. Scenario B would not provide the necessary information to test the landscape level effect hypothesis and is instead site level. So inference of treatment effect is going to be restricted to within treatment boundaries. And on the right, you can just see some examples of what we would learn from each of these, and several of these Terry just went over. So our basic research questions was first, can we find any empirical evidence supporting this landscape level effect hypothesis? And if so, is there enough detailed information to inform strategic and operational decisions such as the spatial and temporal deployment, density, and combination of treatments that are most effective. So from our 26 studies that Terry just showed in our literature review, got pared down to just 26 papers. You can see a geographic distribution here by level 3 ecoregion. 62 study sites were represented in these 26 papers with 93 wildfire treatment pairings. And you can see the vast majority are found in the Western United States, unsurprisingly, with a large proportion in both ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. So already from this kind of limited sample, we're already getting a more narrow view of what we might be able to learn. Just real quickly to describe the data, treatment size paired against wildfire size on the log 10 scale was surprisingly really closely linearly related. That is, as wildfire size increased, they encountered more and more treatments on the ground. The average proportion of a wildfire that had received some form of treatment was 22%. And the mean wildfire size was 9,500 hectares, and the mean treatment size a little under 2,000 hectares. So this kind of stems from our original literature search, where we were really trying to capture landscape as something big, more beyond just stand level. All 26 of these studies met their objectives of altering wildfire outcome in a desirable direction. There was quite a diversity of objectives within that. And all 26 studies documented site level effects to go along with much of the other literature that we were aware of. However, only 11 of the 26 studies actually documented landscape level effect as defined previously. And within these 11 studies, severity, extent, and progression had some evidence of a landscape level effect. No single study exclusively addressed the landscape level in this manner. Severity had the most support from the papers. And just to give a quick overview and not really focus too much on it, but there was some pretty strong indication of a relationship between the proportion of landscape treated and the proportion burned at high severity. A lower proportion of high severity in a treated watershed compared to an adjacent untreated watershed. Lower proportion of high severity in an area adjacent to a large number of prescribed burns compared to untreated areas farther away. Low severity observed in an area with high density of field treatments, and fire severity increased with increasing distance from prescribed fire patches. Extent was another parameter where there was some evidence, and I have an asterisk there because even this was a mixture between empirical and model based. So the modeling aspect looked at, well, if there weren't treatments there, how would this fire have burned? And so in 11 out of 14 of these fires, extent was reduced by an average of 13%. However, in the other 3 fires, the extent actually increased. And in a similar study, extent decreased by 64% in 54 wildfires, whereas in 19 of them, it increased. For progression, there are really 2 main studies to look at this. One, fuel breaks, where 23% of over 600 wildfires intersected a portion of a fuel break. Some of them were stopped while others crossed the break, and suppression was critical in all of these, where fewer than 1% of the fires were stopped by the break alone. So the break really allowing for fire suppression was the key. And then in a similar study, basically very similar results with only 1 fire altered without fire suppression. Previous wildfires used as a treatment, this obviously comes up a lot in wilderness, and as more and more acres burn every year, 60% of over 1,000 wildfires intersected some part of a boundary of a previous wildfire. And progression was limited in some of these fires, but that effect decayed with time, understandably, and also in warmer and drier forests. In a separate study, 40% of wildfires encountered the perimeter of a previous wildfire, and progression was limited in only 8.7% of these, and the effects decayed with time. So yes, we do see that there is some empirical evidence to support the landscape level effect hypothesis that treatments can have an effect outside of their boundary. But is there enough detailed information to turn this into strategic and operational decisions? And the answer is no. So we're really still at an infancy of what we know in terms of being able to apply that on the ground based from an empirical learning standpoint. So if we circle back around to the distinction between site and landscape, it really gets at the idea of what are we talking about here with landscape, because the term does get thrown around quite loosely. And oftentimes when we think about it, we're thinking about size. And so here we're talking about landscape as a process versus landscape as a scale. When we think of wildfire, wildfire is a landscape level process. And so when we think about field treatments and field treatment effectiveness, it should also be evaluated by how it affects that process functionally from a landscape perspective. So concepts of patch dynamics and contagion and proximity come into play here. So landscape scale or landscape size, they have little generalizable meaning. Large wildfires and large treatments, they may be called landscape, but our inference will still be constrained to within sites if site level is the design and the analysis. And so when we think about what we need to do to implement studies to get at this, and it was kind of what Terry was just touching on in the previous talk, is we have to think about a long-term perspective, similar to how we do long-term monitoring of biological resources to inform management decisions, setting up replicated studies across space and really putting the time in or allowing time for wildfires to burn and learn from them in more an empirically based way. Our next speaker is going to talk about the larger body of work from simulation studies, and that is Jeff Ott.
Okay, thanks everyone. I want to thank the organizers of this webinar and participants. So I'm going to talk about the simulation modeling part of this project. And so this is a complement to what Sean was talking about, a different angle of how to approach this question of landscape scale fuel treatment effectiveness. So fire simulation modeling is a way of getting around these challenges that Sean was talking about of studying fires and fuel treatments empirically. So instead of having to implement actual fires, actual fuel treatments, wait for a wildfire, you can build a model landscape in a GIS and simulate how fire would behave on that landscape. So these figures show how fuel treatments can influence fire spread and behavior, in this case using a minimum travel time algorithm. These types of simulation models are very useful for addressing landscape scale research questions, as long as you keep in mind that the models are simplifications of reality and they don't reflect exactly what would happen in the real world. So for our part of this review, we identified a set of studies that met certain criteria. Drawing from this body of literature, we looked for studies that had a comparison of landscape scale scenarios, where they compared one or more fuel reduction treatment scenarios. They use simulation modeling to measure fire response, and they're based on landscapes from the United States or Canada. And this is an example from work by Kevin Osborne in Northern California. You can see the outline of the landscape, the location of proposed treatments involving mechanical or prescribed fire. The no treatment scenario represents the background state, and it serves as a point of comparison. So it's similar to the control treatment in an experiment. You can think of these as if there were experiments. Each of the scenarios is like a treatment level, and the measurements are the outcomes of running fire simulations for each scenario. Here's some stats on the papers that met the criteria. There were 86 papers, most of them journal articles, 93 studies. A study is a specific landscape that was looked at by a paper. You can see the location of these landscapes. The size of the landscapes range from around 200 hectares up to over 3 million hectares, a broad range. Some of the studies were just looking at fire effects within a single year. Others followed across multiple years the dynamics of landscapes, the feedback between fire and vegetation succession. A number of different modeling platforms were used. And you can see some of those here, both for modeling the fires and for representing dynamics in the landscape. And some of the studies also use treatment optimization techniques, which are algorithms for determining where or when to carry out fuel treatments in order to optimize desired outcomes. So as part of this review, we extracted numerical data from these studies. And I'm just going to quickly explain how this was done so you understand the figures that I'm going to be showing here. We focused on response variables directly related to wildfire, burn probability, burn area, and other things. We differentiated 3 wildfire categories that were presented in these papers: the overall wildfire, damaging wildfire, and beneficial wildfire, based on intensity and severity and other factors that were labeled in these papers. We extracted mean values of response variables for each scenario, and we summarized values of treatment scenarios relative to untreated controls. So this was a way of standardizing across all these different studies and making it possible to compare them. So this figure shows these relativized values of fire responses across studies and scenarios for a subset of the studies from California. Each line here is a different study, and each of the dots is a specific treatment scenario that was tested. There are separate panels here for overall damaging and beneficial wildfire, and the x-axis is the response variable relative to the untreated scenario. So if it's less than 1, the response was lower, then the untreated greater than 1 was greater. Most of the points in the overall and damaging wildfire categories were lower than untreated, which is what you would generally want for those cases, indicating that the treatments were effective to varying degrees. For beneficial wildfire, there were only a few cases where this was tested, and most cases the effects were greater, which is also what you would hope for. So this shows that applying these fuel treatments generally makes a difference. So the next question is, what makes some scenarios more effective than others? So to answer this question, we can look at the factors that were tested in these studies. There are factors that are related to fuel treatment design, and there were 5 major elements that came up in these studies: the extent or the total area treated, the size of individual treatment units, the placement of treatments, the prescriptions that were used, and the timing of the treatments. And in addition, some studies also looked at factors beyond treatments, such as fire weather, the climate scenarios, and other aspects of fire and management. So I'm going to present a few of the key findings related to some of these factors. So for treatment extent, studies indicated that treatment effectiveness was generally greater with larger treated area, sometimes but not always with diminishing returns as treatment area increased. So if you look at these examples on the left from some specific studies, the amount of landscape treated is on the x-axis, and as treated area increases, there's this decrease in fire impacts, but they eventually level off. And so this is an example of these diminishing returns. These same studies are shown on these figures on the right. They're rotated 90 degrees. And other studies that we found that tested extent. And some of these other studies also show this pattern of diminishing returns, but others didn't so much. So it suggested that there's some variability in this relationship between treatment extent and fire responses. Another finding related to treatment placement and timing is that using optimization algorithms to determine placement and or timing of treatments generally led to greater effectiveness compared to other schemes. And this figure shows the effects of some different placement schemes where the lines connect comparisons that were made within a study. And for optimized placement, the impacts were lower than the other alternatives, especially when you're comparing against random placement. Some studies looked at placement in terms of which features of the landscape are the highest priority for treatment. So prioritizing treatments in stands with the greatest fire threat generally led to a greater reduction of wildfire at the landscape scale compared to prioritizing stands in the wildland-urban interface. But if you're prioritizing the wildland-urban interface, the WUI, that was generally more effective for protecting the WUI itself. And this figure shows the effects of the overall landscape, but keeping in mind that can be different when you're just looking at the WUI. And the point here is that deciding the best way to place treatments may differ depending on what the main objective of those treatments are. And so lastly, I'm going to point out a couple of findings related to weather and climate. More extreme fire weather led to greater wildfire extent, but not necessarily less treatment effectiveness relative to untreated scenarios. And this is partly because as the amount of fire increases, there's more of a chance that fires will intersect with field treatments and that they'll play a greater role in affecting fire behavior. And effectiveness varied across climate change scenarios due to effects of climate on both fire weather and vegetation and fuel dynamics. This figure is from Lohman et al. 2018. It's an example of looking at fire effects across different climate change scenarios for a landscape in New Mexico. And the effects of treatments differ depending on the climate scenario. There were relatively few studies that incorporate fire change into the modeling. So this is an area where further work is needed. So point out the paper that you can refer to for more detail and the individual papers that we review as well. Contacts of myself and my co-author Francis Kilkenny are shown here. So I'm going to pass it on to Ali, who is going to talk about case studies.
Hi, everyone. Let me get this set up. All right, is that sharing correctly?
Yep, looks good.
All right, thanks. So yeah, I'm Ali Urza. I'm a research ecologist with RMRS in Reno. I'm going to kind of present on the last portion of our synthesis where we reviewed wildland fire case studies. I worked on this with Bryce Hanberry and the incredible Terry Jane, of course. So as Sean described, there are pretty limited opportunities to empirically evaluate fuel treatment effectiveness at landscape scales. There are a lot of confounding effects. It's really hard to control for those confounding effects. And so case studies are often developed after high-profile wildfire events. Fire managers will often use direct observations of kind of narratives of the progression of fires and then post-fire assessments to describe how wildfires have interacted with existing fuel treatments to affect fire behavior, suppression opportunities, and outcomes. And so while these case studies are kind of by definition anecdotal, they provide a real life context behind the interaction between fires and fuel treatments. And they're real gold mines of information. So the perspectives that are available in case studies are often really unique and really hard to measure empirically. So for this portion of the synthesis, we looked at 18 case study reports that were, this is a sampling of some of the titles. Many of you may have worked on some of these. These were either case study reports of individual wildfire events, sometimes complexes of fires, or kind of multiple fires that happen in a particular region that were assessed after the fact by manager-led teams. All of these case studies were super different. Some of them were hundreds of pages long and others were shorter. So we used a thematic synthesis approach. So we basically developed a series of questions that we extracted information from all of these case studies so we could come away with some kind of more generalizable lessons learned. This map shows the distribution of the wildfires that were evaluated by the different case studies. So the red swatches are the different wildfires. A few things stand out really clearly. Obviously, most of these case studies were located in the Western US. So we didn't find any case studies from the East or the Southeastern regions of the US. We found one study in the Great Lakes region, and otherwise all of the studies were in the Western states. And all of these studies were focused on forest ecosystems predominantly. A few of them had included discussion of fuel treatments in kind of mosaics of shrublands and grasslands, but forests were really the kind of primary focus. So as Sean described with the empirical papers, a lot of the case studies compared treated and non-treated areas to kind of assess these site level fuel treatment effectiveness. So comparing a treated stand and a non-treated stand in terms of fire behavior, fire severity, percent tree mortality, and things like that. And a lot of the case studies described a reduction in kind of the adverse effects of wildfire at the site scale. But all of the case studies also described how fuel treatments impacted the landscape scale progression of wildfires and how they affected or didn't affect the kind of overall outcomes of the fire. Oops. Not mean to have that animated, but this photo here is from a wildfire in Arizona. This shows one example of how a fire moved from a high intensity crown fire, kind of at the top of that hill. It dropped into a surface fire, mixed severity fire as it moved into the fuel treatment area in kind of that middle band. And that allowed suppression resources to effectively protect the community, the residential area at the bottom of the photo. And this was something that was commonly described. So as fires moved through these treated areas, fire behavior changed, became reduced in intensity. This resulted in reduced spotting distances, less torching, and overall slower rates of spread. Another really unique takeaway from the case studies that is really hard to measure was the effect of fuel treatments on suppression efforts and how those suppression efforts then kind of change the trajectory of wildfires. So a lot of the case studies described how fuel treatments facilitated burnout operations. They greatly reduced the amount of prep time needed for burnouts, and they were often used as as locations to initiate burnout operations. Fuel treatments were also used for fire line construction, anchor points and safety zones, structure protection, and then the reduced surface fuels in many of these treatments facilitated spot fire suppression. And overall, kind of one of the themes that stood out to me in the case studies was that the larger fuel treatments often increased the perception of safety among firefighters. And this really changed people's willingness to put suppression resources into particular areas. All right, so of course, the fuel treatments weren't considered universally effective, and there are a number of factors that influenced how effective they were. Some of these factors that I'll talk about kind of repeat or support the findings from the empirical and simulation studies, and some of them are a little bit different. So super importantly, and this kind of goes back to Terry's discussion of the principles of fuel treatment, treatment design was super important in determining how effective they were. So many case studies described how larger treatments that reduced fuel loads in multiple fuel layers, so surface fuels, bladder fuels, and crown fuels were most effective. The case studies described this in different ways. Some described how the combination of prescribed fire and thinning was more effective than each of those treatments on their own. Others described how treatments that resulted in an increase in surface fuels, so like lop and scatter and mastication, often resulted in high soil fire severity. Another important factor was the recency of treatment implementation. So somewhat obviously, recent treatments were considered more effective at mitigating fire behavior and reducing fire severity than older treatments. This is a complicated topic because obviously the length of time needed before retreatment depends on a lot of factors, site productivity and species involved. But this was a very common theme when kind of assessing individual landscapes, that the more recent treatments were more effective, and more recent past wildfires were more effective at mitigating adverse wildfire effects. When we're thinking about these kind of landscape scale processes, fuel treatment effectiveness was very influenced by where those treatments were placed on the landscape. So treatments that were located on steep slopes were generally less effective than treatments that were located on ridge tops, where the rate of spread is already somewhat slowing, and the treatments were more effective in those conditions. Networks of larger treated areas were considered to be more effective than smaller disconnected areas or narrow fuel treatments, where that could be easily breached by fast-moving fires. And I think one of the interesting themes that came up in a few of the case studies was that treatments could leverage either previous treatments, past wildfire boundaries, natural fire breaks to basically increase the footprint of a reduced fuel area that a fire has to move through. So kind of leveraging that landscape context. And then also considering prevailing winds, consideration of suppression needs, especially in the WUI. So things like access and egress increased the ability to use fuel treatments as for suppression. And then a common theme, kind of echoing what's been said before, many of the case studies described how during periods of extreme fire weather, treatments were overwhelmed in some cases. So they were made either less effective or ineffective. The case studies described a number of really important barriers to implementation that I think are super important to talk about in a management context. So many people describe limited resources and competing objectives. So for example, even though there's broadening awareness that these landscape scale treatment designs can be more effective than smaller individual treatments, there's still a lot of pressure to implement small treatments that target particular high value resources. And then of course, management targets for treating new acres compete with retreatment needs. A bunch of research gaps were identified, and other people have talked about this in the last couple of presentations, but we have really little information about landscape scale fuel treatment effectiveness in non-forested ecosystems or in mosaics of forests and non-forests. So for example, ecosystems, shrublands and dry woodlands that are invaded by non-native annual grasses, where fuel treatments are an important kind of management component, but these case studies don't so far really exist for those larger fires in those ecosystems. And also thinking about cost-benefit trade-offs between intensive small-scale treatment, so putting a lot of money in small places versus spreading money over larger landscapes. And then of course, as I mentioned, we still have a lot to learn about fuel treatment longevity. So that is all that I had to cover. I'm happy to answer questions if anyone wants to email, and I will hand it over to Jamie to lead off on the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sally, and thanks to all the presenters. It was wonderful information, and you all stayed on time. That's fantastic. So if you want to open your cameras, I'll go through. So how this is going to work is I'll go through some of the Q&A, a couple of questions for each presenter. Maybe we can get through all of them. And then we're going to introduce Ali Reiner, who will give us a bit of a management perspective. and we'll have some poll questions. But first we'll do some Q&A, and also Sharon Hood is able to join us for the Q&A. So Terry, I'm not sure if you want to answer some of those questions or if Sharon does, but I'll bring them up, and whoever pops on first can answer. So one of the first questions was, is private land included in your synthesis of literature for this publication? This was referring to Sharon's work. Are the conclusions you're presenting today only from public lands?
This is Terry. They were all land. From Sharon Hood's perspective, the paper we wrote, we were thinking of all land. And Sharon can elaborate on that, but it isn't tied to any federal or anything, because honestly, it's a lot of different ownership on that, and that can have a huge effect.
Great, thank you. And then another one, can you say more about the difference between treatments for fuels reduction versus treatments for restoration? Most fuels reduction treatments I've seen proposed by agencies say they're doing both.
I can take that. So I think that goes back to the original project objective. So there will certainly be a lot that are aligned with both restoration and fuel treatment objectives. But say, like, if you're in areas where I oftentimes see a difference is some of our higher elevation forests that would typically burn under high severity, that we're doing fuel treatments that might not necessarily be restoration, because those would be, you would expect those forests to burn under high intensity anyway, but maybe they're in the wildland urban interface, and we really are trying to reduce fire intensity around communities. So it's less focus on restoration. So they often align, but they can be very different.
Great, thank you. And there were some other questions for Terry that she answered in the Q&A. So people are welcome to check those responses out too. Okay, question for Sean. Did your study differentiate between types of treatment and effects? For example, thinning versus prescribed fire?
Yeah, I saw that. I tried to type in there. I don't know why it wasn't working. That's a good question. Many of the studies didn't distinguish between the types of treatments too well. We collected that information in our spreadsheet, so we do have it. If anyone was interested, I'm happy to share. We have a lot of detailed information from the papers, but as we drilled down, it really wasn't enough to really do any other level of analysis. A lot of it was kind of all rolled up into a single treatment effect.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Sean. Was the wildfire type taken into consideration, i.e. full suppression strategy versus wildfire for resource benefit?
No, not from, again, in the end, for truly landscape level, as we're defining it, really only 11 papers. And I think, as I pointed out, none of them, that was the primary point of the study. So it really was kind of serendipity, to be honest with you, of how those effects were found. Some, pretty much all post hoc. And so really kind of the approach going in wasn't set up to really address that. So type of fire. So again, really everything was rolled in. Most papers, it's been a little while, I want to say all avoided analysis of fires that there was suppression on.
Great, thank you. And now I'm not sure if this next question was for Sean or Jeff, but if budget was not a determining factor, what would be a guesstimate of cost of a landscape effect so it could be effectively applied in an actual wildfire?
I would have no idea.
Was that for you, Jeff? I can't remember which talk that went with.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer either. Some studies integrated the cost element, but not often. So
okay, thank you.
I can answer some of that. One of the things that was lacking in the synthesis was these cost-benefit equations. There was very little of that, and we were really disappointed because there just wasn't much of that going on. Most of the cost-benefit in the literature of the 2,000 papers were really specific to a treatment, you know, comparing the treatments themselves and not at a landscape scale. So that is one area that is really lacking in the literature.
Thanks, Terry. All right, another question for Jeff. In trying to tease out the effects of fuels treatments on landscape processes, has anyone looked at other management activities such as increased recreation, which might increase human-caused fires, livestock grazing, removing fine fuels versus spreading flammable exotics, et cetera? These variables might have a landscape effect, especially those that are widespread uses.
Yeah, those types of things can be included in the models, and some of the models did have ignition frequency, for example, and where ignitions were likely to start. The thing about exotic annuals and their effects, that is an interesting question, and more work is needed to be done on that from simulation modeling perspective, because most of these studies were from forested ecosystems looking at fuel treatments in forests. And there are other systems out there where these same type of modeling efforts can be done, and we can learn from that.
Great, thanks. And another question for you, Jeff. Given the high effectiveness of site treatments, will treatments designed to yield more post-fire refugia give better long-term results?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm quite the one to answer that.
Anyone else have thoughts?
Anyone else?
Do you mind reading it one more time?
Sure. Given the high effectiveness of site treatments, will treatments designed to yield more post-fire refugia give better long-term results?
I guess I'm not clear exactly what would mean by post-fire refugia. But I would say just in principle, I would think if you have the characteristics that yielded high effectiveness for site level, I would think those would have some type of permeating effect into their adjacent untreated area, i.e. a landscape level effect. Post-fire refugia usually means maintaining conditions prior to a disturbance event. So I may be missing something there, but I would think that would be the opposite of having an effectiveness. It would be a maintaining the current state.
Okay.
I could kind of follow up. I think maybe Tish, I agree with Sean's answer and think that's where, you know, if there are places on the landscape where you've identified where you want that are really important for refugia and trying to keep those unburned patches, you know, some sensitive plants or whatever your objectives are, that's where the importance of the fuel treatment placement in relation to topography and wind, you know, predominant wind directions and things you could maximize or potentially maximize like how you protect your refugia. So yeah, I think you can, it's more treatment, how you arrange those fuel treatments on the landscape. And also the timing of retreating those to where they're maintained as well.
Yeah, and I have an example of how I kind of used landscape monitoring to write a paper on white pine plantations in northern Idaho. You know, the objective of that was to where to implement plantations so that we have seed source going into the future. So if a wildfire were to burn, we don't want to kill those plantations. And so we did an analysis, a post-fire analysis, and identified the plantations that were on the lower slopes as more resistant to fire. Fires just didn't burn through them. And so from that perspective, that iterative approach, we can now turn around and say, okay, if we're going to have white pine or we want refugia, the most protected areas under these wildfires, the extreme wildfires, might be those lower slopes or different topographic features. And so that kind of can inform you as in this by overlooking at the landscape and identifying where may be the places that have the best probability of a refugia or other management objectives that you might want.
Thank you so much, everyone, for clarification on that. Okay, now let's see, Ali, a couple questions for you. Well, one attendee wanted to say that the studies shown by region, or the map of the studies shown by region, were very helpful. So thank you. What a great idea. And then a question, you mentioned that treatments gave firefighters an increased sense of safety. Whether that is the case, what is a safety zone, for example, and under what conditions needs much more evidence than anecdotes? Oh, I guess that was a comment. That being said, this is all really great work. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. I think, all of the case studies are, like I said, by definition, anecdotes, but, I did think the case studies gave, I think, a valuable perspective about how fire managers on the ground during wildfire events are thinking about fuel treatments and potentially using them for suppression activities, whether or not it's the best idea to use them, or whether or not, all of the fuel treatments that are being used for suppression efforts truly are safer places or truly do, provide adequate safety zones, is a question that could be addressed empirically, probably. But yeah, my summary was purely kind of describing the perspectives that were contained in the case studies.
Great, thanks. All right, one more question for you, Ali, and then we'll introduce Ali Reiner and go to our poll questions. And then there's a lot more questions, so we can get to those as well. But first, one more question for you, Ali. Are treatments that create clearings and forest canopy significantly more effective than those that rely solely on canopy thinning?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And at least from our synthesis, we honestly just don't have enough studies to be able to say that yet empirically at the landscape scale. But there's been a lot of really great work about moving from more uniform thinning treatments to like the ICO, individuals, clumps, and openings framework to kind of break up the continuity of crown fuels. But as far as I know, at those different arrangements of kind of canopy distributions haven't been described at these landscape scales. So how those types of fuel treatments impact fire effects beyond the treatment boundaries themselves. So kind of a non-answer. I think, it's a question that I'm really interested in for sure, as someone who thinks a lot about, landscape scale processes and vegetation heterogeneity, but I don't think we're quite there yet with the research.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll get to more questions in a bit, but Corey has a couple of polls he's going to launch so the audience can give their feedback. And while he's doing that, I'm going to introduce Ali Reiner. Ali Reiner is joining the panel today to provide additional perspective bridging the gap between fuels research and management. She works for the Geospatial Technology and Applications Center, GTAC, within the USDA Forest Service, improving burn severity products used by managers and research. The bulk of Ali's Forest Service career was spent with the Forest Service Enterprise Program, which included monitoring fuel treatment effectiveness, fire behavior, and fire effects. Ali worked for a few seasons in prescribed and wildland fire for several federal agencies and serves on wildfire incidents as a long-term fire analyst, providing climate analysis, fire danger, and fire behavior projections to support management decisions. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'll fill a minute here while you fill out the survey. I was trying to type some answers, but have you guys had the issue where you're typing an answer and a new question comes in and they all scroll and your cursor's gone? It's like a video game. Anyway, I think I'm really thankful that these folks took some time to do these basically case studies, compilations of historic case studies and modeling studies, and these gigantic reviews are tough to pull off. You did a great job in short time, and that's fantastic, because as we launch into a addressing the wildfire crisis, this is a first key step, is to like really consolidate what we know. So good job there. I have just a smattering of comments I'll throw out, and I'll try to answer more questions in the video game. You know, I think I really like the framework on how to move forward. I think some of that has already been in occurrence, and some will go in. You know, it will help us frame how to do monitoring. There was a question in the chat about, you know, specific monitoring for folks. There's some of that out there, but some of that needs to be developed. And I'm going to ask everyone in the audience and managers out there to put your thinking cap on specific methods for some of those landscape attributes. They're going to be tricky to get at, and like things like structures lost and suppression costs, I think as a scientific community, we're going to want to relativize those variables. Otherwise, some highly populated areas will be weighted differently in the outcomes. I wanted to just throw out, someone had a question about, you know, can burn severity be used as a measure of fuel treatment? And yes, the answer is yes. I don't know if the question got loaded or my answer got loaded. But yeah, there's a pilot study. I'm just going to call out Jen Stevens and whoever else is on that pilot study in the Pacific Northwest too. And they're trying to come up with computing methods to look at how fire moves through fuel treatments by looking at burn severity and the direction of fire spread. And so hopefully that methodology can get ironed out and get utilized nationally, because we do have some national burn severity data sets. And I think that's what a lot of the effectiveness monitoring comes down to, is data. You know, what kind of data do we have? So, and that's what a lot of folks found on the empirical case studies here. You know, I'm going to throw out a few more ideas while I have the microphone. In the URSA case study review, they noted that previous wildfires are an important driver of large wildfire events. I totally second that. As an LTAN on wildfire incidents, we're always looking, you know, everybody is looking for those large fire scars and how they're going to slow or, you know, slow fire spread ideally. With record snow this year, maybe this is a great year for prescribed and managed fire in mid and upper elevations. So we might want to think about that. In the OTT simulation review, climate was found to be important, and I think we need to figure out how to message to the public that as years go on and we manage the wildfire crisis, you know, this season we will have some moderated fire potential due to climate and record snow. But in future seasons, it's going to seem like we're moving backward in fuel treatment effectiveness. So we have to, you know, kind of manage our expectations that climate really is a big factor in how fires act in these fuel treatments. I actually got a fire manager on the phone yesterday about the Dixie fire, where they had 5-mile spotting in the Dixie fire. And so there's really no fuel treatment that's going to deal with that. You know, you can't pave all of California. So, you know, we're just going to have to, you know, agree that in extreme fire, you know, we have limited options. But, you know, there is this thought in our head that, you know, if we had more fuel treatments across the landscape, perhaps, you know, we could have less plume dominated fires. So I think, you know, further studies like this will be great.
Great, thank you so much, Allie. No, did you have more? Go for it.
You know, one last thing I'll throw out there is the Jeff Ott's simulation review did note that scenarios where fuel treatments are placed in the WUI reduced homes exposed to fire, whereas fuel treatments placed across the landscape resulted in lower landscaped area burned. And so I thought that was an interesting result, in that it actually mirrors our response on incidents. You know, structures and infrastructure are prioritized above resources in the priority structure. And so I think, you know, until as the agencies, or until as, you know, culturally and logistically we can focus more on our wildlands, that we will continue to, you know, struggle in the wildfire crisis. Yeah. And let's get back to the questions.
Great, thank you so much for all those comments. That was great, Allie, thank you. And feel free to jump in with any of these additional questions. Okay, so we'll go back to questions. How does smoke fit into this and collaboration with air quality agencies?
I'll jump in there on that one if we would like. In speaking with managers about what their hurdles are, that is one of them. And as much as we can legislate that we're going to increase the pace and scale of prescribed fire, if the individual air quality districts have caps on that limit it, we have conflicting policies. So that is one of the hurdles for managers for sure.
For me, we didn't have a lot of smoke-related studies. If anything, it might be Jeff's work on the simulation. Some of that might have been some smoke outputs or something like that. But at least I know from the case studies and other ones, they really were weak on that smoke part. And part of it could have been we just didn't isolate on that when we were looking at the landscape perspective. And most of those were interactions with wildfires. So it may be part of the way we focus the research versus the lack of information.
Great, thank you. Oh yeah, I just had that jumping thing happen to me too. I was poised on my next question. Now I gotta find it again. Here we go. I'm curious to hear more about the correlation versus the cause-effect relationship between landscape level effects and fuels treatments. Often fuels treatments, particularly prescribed fires, are applied on sites where they are manageable. How might this location bias affect some of the conclusions about landscape level fuel treatment effectiveness?
I could maybe offer an initial answer, or you can go, Allie. Sure.
Well, if you have an answer primed, go for it, Sharon.
Well, I was just thinking, so, I mean, this is really the person that asked the question is totally right, that the effectiveness will totally change depending on our landscapes that are dominated, say, by wilderness areas where we have very limited ability to do field treatments, but maybe we could, depending on the area, we could allow more wildland fires for resource benefit, things like that. Your hands are just tied, and when we have like restrictions, or like say the federal agencies, where if we're operating in the landscapes that are more dominated by private lands, it's going to shift the focus on what can happen, who does the work in different locations. So the actual landscape you're working in will, and how, and what kind of field treatments you can do and who's there to do the work. It will really vary from place to place.
Great, thanks. Did you want to add to that, Allie? Or should I jump to the next one?
Sharon covered it great.
Okay, great.
I can just point out something that I think the simulation modeling approach is useful for this type of thing. If you're comparing your prescribed fire in an area that's already in pretty good condition with untreated scenario, maybe the difference isn't going to be that big. So you can figure out where the areas are that you can treat that are going to have the biggest impact, making a difference. And I think this goes back to the smoke issue. You could think about how the smoke from prescribed fire compared against the smoke from a wildfire is going to be a contrast you can make to show that even though there is that smoke impact for prescribed fire, it could be a lot less than the wildfire that would happen otherwise.
Thank you. Another question, I'm not familiar with optimization algorithms. I'd be interested in hearing about what those are and how to utilize, realizing that it is different in scope than this webinar.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of information about all the optimization algorithms, but it's something to look up. There were a lot of different algorithms that showed up in these studies. The most common one was the treatment optimization model. and there are others that are in process of development. So just encourage people to look those up.
Thank you. What are the most important variables to quantify with field-based monitoring of fuels restoration treatments to improve landscape simulation models of fire behavior?
I'll jump in on that one, but the other panelists are welcome. I strongly feel in fuels, we need to head towards 3D measurement and 3D modeling ideally, although neither of those are fully functional yet. Our current fire behavior models that we use stylized fuel models. So as much as we can take data in the field, that data isn't directly or even at all used in the fuel models that are priming the fire behavior models. So there's a definite difficulty there.
Yeah, I agree with what Ali just said, and then, so we can, but I would also add that, stand density and our forested ecosystems is a really big driver if the objective is to get fuel treatments to be able to, say, drop a crown fire to turn into a surface fire. So if you're really trying to, that's going to be strongly dictated by our canopy base, bulk density, canopy base heights, things like that. So our basic forest structure variables of tree density that can then be where we can calculate our canopy fuels will really drive crown fire potential. So I would say that's those are big variables are important variables to measure. And then looking at our surface fuel loadings that can really inform especially with spotting potential and kind of how the if you're going to have a lot of embers landing, what kind of fuels are those embers going to land on, and the likelihood of starting additional fires that would increase rates of spread and make wildfires harder to control. But yeah, right now with our current fire behavior models tied to our stylized fuel behavior, our fire behavior fuel models, our hands are kind of tied in a lot of the modeling world.
Thanks for those responses. Jeff, Terry said that you'll be having a podcast on your simulation study. So I don't know, we have a bunch more questions, but before we get carried away, I didn't know if you wanted to mention that briefly.
Yeah, there's going to be a podcast that we recorded in association with the Fire Ecology Journal, and that'll probably come out this summer.
Great. We'll put a link to that on the website that Corey's been putting in the chat. We'll put a link to it on that site so people can find it. Okay, another question. To detect a meaningful landscape scale effect that exceeds the effect of the treatment itself from a particular treatment would need to show that an effect is detected outside that treatment, not including the treatment area. I don't think that in several reported cases, this is how the effect was determined. Oh, this is a question for Sean. I don't know if, did that make sense?
Yeah, I didn't take that as a question. It's just I think it's a reiteration of what I said, right? The landscape level effect is effects outside of treatment boundaries. That's the distinguishing key element of what came out of the empirical studies that were still largely site level based at the time of this study, at the time of the literature review. So yes, that's when it comes down. I saw some other questions about designing the monitoring, how people can help. My personal belief is that's really the work where the work needs to be done, is coming up with ways to measure this effectively. Obviously, principles of landscape ecology will come into play, but I personally haven't given it a lot of thought. But I think it's a rich area that needs attention. That's the next step, at least a part of this broader approach. that needs to happen. But yes, you'd have to somehow measure effectiveness outside of the treatment boundary to show that you are having an effect on a landscape level process.
Great, thank you. I'll ask maybe one or two more questions. There's so many great questions. I think we'll need to consolidate all these and maybe have some written answers that we can compile the answers from the team and then send it back to everyone. But we only have time for a couple more questions before we. So hasn't the research shown that the odds a thinned patch will burn before it grows back is less than 1%? In other words, is it a shot in the dark, as we cannot know where the wildfire will burn? So as to longevity and durability, it has already been asked and answered in the negative.
I think both Sarah and I could kind of deal with that question. I think you're right. I mean, we don't know when a fire is going to hit. So one of the things that we need to think about is all the other social and ecological values that are there. And also we know where is the greatest chance of wildfires. You know, California has quite a few wildfires, those kind of things. What is the probability and chance of a particular fire occurring in a particular place? And there is research that kind of ends up that direction. Some of the work by Alan Ager and others have really focused on what is the chance of a fire existing in a particular place. But whether we like it or not, fire is here. And as we go into climate change, we're going to have more fire. And we're also going to have other disturbances. So when we talk about fuel treatments, and I think that's what Sharon is emphasizing as well as I, when you had that link of silviculture between other management objectives versus fuel treatment only objectives, I think we need to think broader and to think about how a particular treatment, whatever it is going to be affected by fire, but also how's it going to address other objectives. And that's where this fire diffusion comes in. That's where the variability across the landscape becomes even more important. Hope I answered that.
Yeah, I just follow up on Terry's answer. I agree, and that's where we in our ecosystems where our objectives of fuel treatments and restoration align really well. You know, that's where even we know that kind of restoration based fuel treatments can also be effective at increasing resilience to drought. It can often reduce the likelihood of reduce the severity of, in the case of bark beetle outbreaks. So we know these fuel treatments can have other benefits, even if a fire doesn't occur, within the time frame of when that fuel treatment might be effective for reducing fire intensity. So I feel like it doesn't discount the need to do fuel treatments. And then in areas where, say, restoration and fuel treatments, their objectives don't necessarily align well, like say around in our wildland, in our urban interface, we don't know when fires are going to occur, like Terry said, but we know they will occur. So how we can build more resilient communities and try to and make our areas around our communities as safe as possible. That just it seems like it's something we have to implement fuel treatments around, instead of just, I guess I would say, instead of just giving up and saying we don't know when they're going to occur, so this is it's not worth it. So I would it basically gives we know we need to do work around our area of highly flammable wildlands that are near communities and other infrastructure. So that's how I would answer that.
Thank you so much. Well, for questions, I'm going to leave it at that. Like I said, we'll compile. There's so many wonderful questions. Thank you everyone for your participation, and we'll gather these questions and get them back out to the panel and get some answers and post them on the website. And Corey, if you wouldn't mind posting that website link back up in the chat so people can have that. And I think he's going to follow up with an email. Thank you all panelists. Is there any, I know we're at the bottom of the hour, but I wanted to give give any of you, if you had some final words, a chance to say anything briefly before we close out.
Thanks very much for putting this on. Happy to participate. I'm glad so many people found interested in it and hopefully learned some useful information.
Yeah, there are lots of notes of thanks. All right, great. Thank you.
I guess I would like to thank also everyone for showing up. And actually this Joint Fire Sciences, when they approached us, I thought we didn't really know how effective this type of synthesis would be. And so really, I think that one of the valuable things that came out of this is really developing into sub-teams and understanding how the different kinds of literature really can't be mixed together and tell a cohesive story. The second one were the case studies. We wanted to interview managers, but because of COVID, it just didn't work. So we had to think outside the box. And how we developed a way to basically ask the case studies a series of questions was really a good way to pull in a really wide range of information into a cohesive story. And so I would recommend everybody to look at the Science You Can Use, issue 59. It's on the link, as well as the overall report of the Joint Fire Sciences. That might give you a more of an integrated look about how all of the 4 studies actually work together.
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you again to all the presenters. Wonderful information. Thank you, Ali Reiner, for joining us and sharing your perspective. And thank you to all the participants and great questions, and we'll follow up soon. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Corey.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks everybody, especially speakers and participants. And participants, please fill out the survey that should pop up on your screen as you exit, and we'll go ahead and end it there. Thanks, everyone.